We really appreciate it. I want to wish you all a happy Women's History Month. And we are indeed making ERA history this month and have been and will continue until the ERA is the 28th Amendment to the United States Constitution. We have a lot to celebrate. We have 38 states now ratified. The House of Representatives has now passed the deadline removal legislation, and we are in the Senate. I would encourage everyone to go over to the website and read Dr. Turner, who is our League of Women Voters of the United States, read her statements about the ERA, about Women's History Month, and about the deadline removal being passed through the House. This is at the top of the agenda for the League. And there's also a lot of other information there that you should check out. So you should definitely go over there and do that. I want to express gratitude to the League of Women Voters of Chillicothe-Ross County and the president, Sarah Skinner, and to my mom, Portia Bolger, for opening the door to the League for me. It's been my pleasure to work with the League on ERA, various projects since back in 2013. And I'm really blessed and honored to be a part of this organization. I'd also like to thank our ERA committee members, Tanya Brown, Bart Henshaw, Sharon Beerhall, Dawn Zarbash, Dee Stevenson, and Patrice Allen Hussey, and also the members collaborating with our committee, other ERA advocates from across the country, Helene DuBois Swanson, Sharon J. Hill, Kathy Kalin, Carolyn Casper, and Jean Sweeney. And we're going to be hearing from some of these advocates later on during reports later on in our program this evening, from Sharon down in Georgia, and probably from some of the others as well. Also, of course, a huge thank you to our speakers, who I'm going to introduce just in just a moment when I do a quick rundown of how the program will go off tonight, and then we will get right to it. And so we are here tonight to talk about why the ERA is family friendly and why it's nonpartisan, and remind people of its Republican roots. And we want to get Rob Portman to support the ERA and the deadline removal, as we've been doing back in 2012. And so again, like I said, so happy to have on the guests that we have on today for our panel. Julie Suk, who will be speaking first. Dr. Julie Suk is a constitutional scholar, and she is the author of We the Women, the Unstoppable Mothers of the Equal Rights Amendment. She's a professor of sociology and political science and liberal studies at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She is also a Florence Rogarts Visiting Professor of Law and Senior Research Scholar at Yale Law School. And that was in 2020 through 2021. After Julie speaks, we'll be hearing from Susan J. Bevan. Susan, among many other things, served on the board of the ERA Coalition and spoke on its behalf at a Senate briefing when Senator Murkowski and Cardin introduced the deadline requirement for ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. She also joined a small group of former coalition board members to found the ERA project at Columbia University Law School, and now is on the ERA Project Advisory Board. After we hear from Susan, we will then hear from Steve Anderson, who is the former Republican member of the Illinois House of Representatives, representing the 65th District, who helped to pass the ERA in Illinois, making it the 37th state to do so as a state representative. He is a board member of the ERA Coalition, Board Fund for Women's Equality, and the executive director of the technical difficulty. The executive director of Republicans for the ERA. He now travels the country advocating for the passage of the ERA at the state level and at the federal level. After we hear from Steve, we will hear from Nevada State Senator Patricia Spearman. She is also a pastor and retired soldier, and she led her state of Nevada to become the 36th state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment in 2017. That was the first state to do so in the 21st century. Since then, she has advocated across the country to ensure the ERA becomes the 28th Amendment, including testifying before the United States Congress in support of the joint resolution, removing the deadline for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. After Senator Spearman speaks, we will have some reports from various people, including Sharon J. Hill down in Georgia. And after the reports, we will open it up for Q&A, and then Sarah will close this out with some announcements and our actions that we need to take. So thank you all, and take it away, Julie.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Tammy, and thank you so much to the League of Women Voters of Chillicothe, Ohio, for sponsoring this very important conversation. And I am a scholar of constitutional gender equality around the world, actually. And I came to writing about the ERA after studying the history of gender equality amendments in other countries. And one of the most striking things about the origins of gender equality amendments in our European peer countries, like Germany after World War II, France after World War II, Italy. One thing that's very common is not only that there's an equal rights amendment in many constitutions around the world, but at the same moment that an equal rights amendment was adopted, there was also a constitutional provision protecting mothers. Motherhood shall deserve the special care and protection of the community, and so forth. And that's a very common provision. And what's also really interesting in the history of countries like Germany and Italy is that you saw women from across the political spectrum, the Christian Democrats and the socialists and the communists converging and forming a coalition in their commitment to having a constitutional provision proclaiming the equal rights of women, and also a constitutional provision saying that mothers deserve the special protection of the state. And as an American constitutional law scholar, this is a little bit strange. And it's a little bit strange because I think that in US constitutional law, we tend to think of equality, and particularly sex equality or gender equality, as being in tension with recognizing motherhood, because that's a way of distinguishing between the sexes and treating them differently. And what I explore in my work is the way in which this problem or tension, conflicts about whether or not a commitment to gender equality or sex equality or women's equality in the Constitution allows for the different treatment of men and women in certain circumstances. I think there has been a great deal of confusion since the beginning, really, since 1923, all the way up until now, about that particular proposition, whether or not you could have a gender equality amendment and still respect certain differences between men and women, differences or differences that occur because of the history of disadvantage and subordination of women based on their traditional roles as mothers, and not just traditional roles as mothers, which need not be denigrated, but the idea that women were confined to that role and didn't have choices with regard to other roles. And one thing that's so important, not only about ERA at its 1923 origins, where it's really a project of the Republican Party, by the 1940s, both political parties have it on their platform. And in the early 1970s, there's overwhelming bipartisan support for the ERA in Congress. There are only a handful of people in the House and in the Senate who actually oppose it, like well over 90% of both houses in 1970, 71, and 72 supported the ERA and voted for it. So it's a very small and vocal minority that oppose it. And it doesn't fall on party lines. In fact, probably the most vocal opponent in the House was Emanuel Seller, who was a Democrat and was worried about the ERA's effect on labor rights. And in the Senate, the most vocal opponent was Sam Ervin, senator from North Carolina, who argued, and in some ways he prefaced, I mean, the arguments he made had a direct connection to Phyllis Schlafly later, because he argued on the Senate floor that it would destroy American motherhood He said God couldn't be everywhere, so he invented mothers. And if we have this amendment, it's going to be a unisex amendment that destroys motherhood as we know it in America. And of course, those are the kinds of arguments that ended up being copied into Phyllis Schlafly's report and became the basis of a very active Stop ERA movement throughout the 1970s. But the story that I tell in my book, We the Women, and for those of you, if you've purchased the book and would like a signed book plate, please send me an email. I'll put the information in the chat when I'm done talking. One thing that I find is that there were only, when we got started with the ERA in 1970, with Martha Griffith's discharge petition, bringing it to the floor, really forcing it out of the House Judiciary Committee that refused to report it out under the control of Emanuel Seller. She did the discharge petition and got it on the floor. And almost all the women, all but one, there was one Democratic woman, Lenore Sullivan, who didn't support it, also because she was a holdover from another era where there was a real tension between ERA and women's rights in the labor context. But all the women, both Republican and Democrat, supported it. And what's really remarkable is that the first thing Martha Griffith says once they open up the floor debate on the ERA in 1970 on her discharge petition is she says that ERA is needed because it's going to help wife, abandoned wife, and widow support her family. So from the beginning, she's talking about mothers and wives needing this to overcome their economic dependence and overcome all the ways in which those roles actually lead to women's economic insecurity. And then she hands it over to Florence Dwyer, who was a Republican from New Jersey. And she said that she supported the ERA because it was needed to strike down laws that prohibited women from working in certain occupations and excluding them from certain colleges and universities. But she made it very clear that the ERA would not obliterate the differences between male and female. And she said what the amendment was about was women want only what is their due. They want to be treated as whole citizens. They want to be recognized as having a full stake in the life of our nation. And she went on to say that the role of homemaker would be made more dignified by a full commitment to equality rather than denigrated by a full commitment to equality. And then very importantly, Margaret Heckler, who worked in a very bipartisan way with Elizabeth Holtzman many years later to form the Congressional Women's Caucus. She was an early supporter of the ERA in 1970 and 71. And she got on the floor and she said, I do not have any desire to become one of the boys. And she specifically compared the US to other countries with regard to whether they were really women friendly. And instead of just focusing on things like jobs and liberation from the home, she specifically said the biggest difference between the US and other countries that affected women's freedom was the quality and availability of childcare available to working mothers, enlightened attitudes about employment leave for pregnancy. And so there was a way in which where the Democratic women and the Republican women converged. Of course, there were very few of them. We're just talking about 9 women out of like 435 people in the House and 1 woman out of 100 in the Senate at this moment. But where they really converged was on really thinking about ways in which women were disadvantaged in society because of their role as mothers and mothers-to-be. And they also believed that it was not just going to be about courts striking down those laws that excluded women from certain professions and schools. They thought that the ERA would actually empower them as legislators and at the state level as well, state legislators, to make real policy to overcome these inequalities. And this is something that's borne out 50 years later, or when Nevada ratifies in 2017, they talk about equality and what they do, though. It's not just what they say on the floor. What they do after ratifying the ERA, they pass a Pregnant Worker Fairness Act. So that's giving pregnant workers accommodations on the job so that they don't have to get fired if they need accommodations on the job. They pass a breastfeeding law that protects breastfeeding mothers in the workplace. They pass another law on domestic violence. Specifically, unfortunately, in many states' employment laws, you can get fired after being a domestic violence victim. But in Nevada, they passed a law that protects domestic violence victims from being fired and gives them some leave if they need it from their jobs. So what this really shows you is that ERA is not just like a standalone thing. It travels together with many legislative initiatives because you need something more robust, not just like a court decision striking down a bad law, but real lawmaking to recognize the complex ways in which the role of mother and homemaker or wife or caregiver is often undervalued in our society and undervalued, leading to inequality and lack of support. And certainly some of the Democratic women who I haven't mentioned yet, Patsy Mink, first Asian American woman ever elected to Congress, Shirley Chisholm, first African American woman ever elected to Congress. They also were working on childcare legislation, federally funded childcare. They really saw ERA as traveling together with those public policies. Obviously, childcare legislation, very important, as Margaret Heckler, the Republican, pointed out to women's liberation. So I pointed all this out because I think this is what's at stake now, particularly because of the way in which the COVID-19 crisis has really devastated the economic security of women, and particularly working mothers. Just millions of women have left the workforce, and many of those women are mothers who are kind of pushed out of their jobs because of the closure of schools and daycares. And I think there's going to need to be a lot of legislative action to have a full economic recovery. And I don't have much time to go into this now, but one thing I want to say is that the case law about Congress's power to regulate things like domestic violence or violence against women in general, Congress's power to deal with some of the displacements of the pandemic, Congress's power to regulate in all the areas that might affect women's economic security. All of those things have been chipped away in cases about healthcare, in some of the federal district court decisions about the CARES Act, certainly in Supreme Court decisions about the Violence Against Women Act. So Section 2 of the ERA clearly empowers Congress to legislate against inequalities women face in society. And I think that's borne out by the legislative history. And arguably, with an expansive understanding of federal power generally, maybe you wouldn't need the ERA, but I think we exist in a world where the Supreme Court and the lower federal courts have sufficiently attacked congressional power in other contexts, so that having a clear statement right now of Congress's power to promote gender equality is extremely important, having the kinds of policies we need for an economic recovery that is family friendly and achieves equality for working mothers. So I'm going to stop there and hand it over to Susan.
Hello, I would like to thank the League for inviting me to speak with you tonight. As Tammy said, I am a past co-chair of the Republican Majority for Choice. I now serve as a founding member of the advisory board of the Equal Rights Amendment Project at Columbia University's Law School. And Julie Suk is on our academic advisory board, so you can see the quality of people we have. The ERA project was created as a legal think tank to evaluate and provide guidance on issues surrounding the adoption of the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution and its application thereafter. I sometimes say that I represent diversity because the Republican Party seems to be so averse to women's rights, and for some reason my passion for this particular issue is seen to be at odds with Republican ideology. But when I identified as a Republican back as a teenager, because my parents were very involved in local politics in my home state of Washington, it was because I believed in limited government and fiscal conservatism. I still value traditional Republican ideals of small, less burdensome government that trusts its people to decide what is best for themselves. The Republican Party has long prided itself as being a pro-family party, and I support the choices, including the hard choices, that individuals must make for themselves for the health and happiness of their families, including when and whether to have children. It is quite peculiar to me that the Republican Party can say that it believes in limited government, except when it suits personal religious ideologies of a faction of the party. The Republican Party has changed over the past decades. but many believe as I do. Some of us have remained to work within the party while others seek a political home for these values while still fighting for the issues that matter to us. A basic axiom in America is that our citizens have the right to be free from unwarranted government interference. Individual liberty was always considered to be central to the philosophy of the Republican Party. In fact, in the 2012 Republican platform, it said, trust the people, limit government. These ideals cannot be applied in some instances and ignored in others. They must extend to all policy areas, even social issues, including those surrounding matters that impact our families and their well-being. Over the years, I've had plenty of opportunities to witness the disparity between the advantages granted to men by virtue of both law and society versus those allowed to women. Certainly over these decades, we have seen slow improvement in the equality of treatment between the sexes, but it is far from truly complete or equal. Many who say they are committed to equality and civil rights are still challenging the basic rights of women. This is both hypocritical and lacks common sense. The pandemic has sort of pulled back the curtain regarding the economic distance between men and women. While those who could work from home still brought in a paycheck, those who were in frontline service positions saw a grave impact on their families. Unfortunately, these impacts were disproportionately felt by women and minorities, who not only make up a large portion of the service industry, but they also take on inordinate responsibility for childcare. Even if it is only that often it is the mother who is tasked with trying to find or replace a babysitter. The workload is just heavier for women, which impacts their children and families. So here's a question for us all to ponder. How do we get society, meaning government, as well as large and small businesses, to understand that what women do away from paid employment is critical? We quite literally grow the next generation of consumers and employees in our own bodies. Women uniquely bear this burden. Personally, I suggest that enforced time off for all employees would help level the playing field for women who must take time off to give birth and recover from that essential task. Now, as a Republican, I have a hard time figuring out how to best make that concept fit with my ideology, but I invite all Republicans to grapple with the same challenge. What could be better for supporting family formation and stability than preventing the penalty that women must pay for taking that postpartum time off? Republicans should love this idea. If you're an employer or are related to an employer, have these conversations. If you are a customer or an employee, use your voice and also have these conversations. Nothing changes unless we do. And this is where the ERA can really help families. While I view issues from the lens of a traditional Republican, the ERA itself really should not be a partisan issue. Of course, the original ERA was written by a Republican, Alice Paul, and the Republican Party was the first to approve it in the 40s and 50s. Former First Lady Betty Ford was a strong and vocal supporter of the ERA, and there were at least 3 Republican presidents who also actively endorsed it, including Ford, of course, Eisenhower, and Nixon. As Julie noted, when Congress passed the ERA in 1972, with overwhelming support from both sides of the aisle, state legislatures raced to be the first to ratify it. I know that the Chillicothe-Ross League has been engaged with the issue since the 70s as well, with Ohio having ratified the ERA promptly in 1974. Unfortunately, after more than 2 decades of explicit support for the ERA, in 1980, Republicans bowed to pressure from an insurgent wing of the party with restrictive social issue ideologies and removed ERA support from their convention platform. Since then, ERA opponents have conflated the issue with abortion and other social issues in order to create a divisiveness that more benefits those who would use it to draw stark lines to be fought over, thus levering it for political advantage than for any substantive reason. It just need not be so. It is important to keep in mind that the Equal Rights Amendment says nothing about social issues or how they will be interpreted or governed. It is an amendment that prohibits discrimination. It does not require confirmation. Of course, there are compelling political reasons for both houses of Congress to pass the resolution to remove the deadline, including the importance of women in the electorate, but there are also strong economic reasons to support ratification of the ERA. The inclusion of the ERA in the US Constitution will benefit all women, including, of course, Republican women. Republican women face discrimination in employment and legal access, just like all women. In fact, a McKinsey study in 2016 stated that if women were to participate in the economy identically to men, they could add as much as $28 trillion, or 26%, to annual global GDP in 2025. So, while it is important to remember that the amendment applies to state actors, it is reasonable to believe that the benefits of denying discrimination against women will inevitably permeate the world of private business, thus lifting the economic power of women throughout the country. It simply would be difficult to enforce pay equity without the protections of the ERA. As an economic force, women uniquely support their families, and everything from family nutrition to education are enhanced by the benefits of treating women as equal under the law. Even in a two-income family, it is not possible to understate the contributions that each partner brings to the table, meaning that men should be just as supportive of ensuring that women have legal and economic protections as women are. This matters to me because I've watched the Republican Party diminish across the country and threaten to become a regional party with restrictive social views and little fiscal responsibility. A healthy two-party system provides the checks and balances needed to keep our government working. I believe the Republican Party must show its support for economic growth by ensuring that women have equal access to the opportunities that our country provides. In fact, according to a 2015 poll, Republicans do overwhelmingly support the ERA. 93% of all Republicans polled agreed that the US Constitution should guarantee equal rights to men and women, and 90% would support an amendment to do so. Among Republican women alone, 94% agreed that the US Constitution should guarantee equal rights to men and women, and 96% would support an amendment to do so. 96%. Legislators, are you listening? Women vote. The ERA provides the framework to address the challenges that we have in our economy and our legal system. This is the opportunity to correct the omission of more than 50% of our population when women were intentionally left out of our Constitution over 200 years ago. The Equal Rights Amendment will help women and families in ways that are measurable. It is important for our members of Congress to understand that it is not the time for ratification that has expired. It is that the time to treat women as less than full participants in our society that has expired. Thank you all for your efforts to support the removal of the ratification deadline. I hope you will also continue to push for the Equal Rights Amendment in the Ohio Constitution, joining more than 20 other states that expand protections guaranteed to prevent sex discrimination. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And now, Steve Anderson.
Thank you very much, Susan. It's an honor to be here. I am from the state of Illinois, a retired state rep, and my greatest claim to fame, in my opinion, is the fact that I was the Republican sponsor of the ERA and passed it in 2018. I often talk about that there are a few things I'd like nailed on my tombstone or carved into my tombstone. This is number one, and there's really only two. So this is really what it's all about for me, and it really is a passion. I love following Susan in this conversation because she said everything, I believe, with the exception of one thing. But she really stated the case for why Republicans still need to support this, elected Republicans, because as she pointed out, your average run-of-the-mill Republican who's not an elected official already supports it, 90% or more. So this isn't a hard equation. But the part that became hard through this time period, remember, in 1972, as Susan said, there was broad bipartisan support for this. It really wasn't even a question until one woman came onto the scene from Illinois. Her name is Phyllis Schlafly. And Phyllis decided to try to tie abortion and the Equal Rights Amendment together. Now, of course, if you read the Equal Rights Amendment as proposed, it doesn't say anything about abortion. It simply says that there can be no state level discrimination, federal and state, that you cannot discriminate against someone based on sex. That's not that hard a concept. And for many, many years, there was absolutely no support for Mrs., I'll call her Mrs. because that's what she liked to be called, Mrs. Schlafly's position. Now, we have to talk about it though. We can't simply ignore the abortion issue, because if we ignore it, then most of my colleagues will say, well, what you said was very nice, but abortion would be allowed to the 9th month and beyond, and it's a horrible thing, and I can't vote for it because of that. So we have to address the issue. And the way that I have addressed the issue, I'm an attorney by trade, and I have done the research. And what you will find if you do the research that I did was there are really only 2 cases in the entire history of this. And one of them is in the state of New Mexico, and the other is in the state of Connecticut, that speak even remotely to the ERA's nexus with abortion. And what those cases say is that there's a concept called medical necessity when you are dealing with public funds for medical treatment, in other words, Medicare and Medicaid. And so under Medicare and Medicaid, if something is medically necessary, it gets covered. That's different from private insurance, which is largely governed by state level laws, and they can exclude what they want. You know, they can decide something's covered and something else is not covered. But for Medicare and Medicaid purposes, that's not true. So the definition is medical necessity. If it's necessary, you get it. So New Mexico and Connecticut tried to get creative with that. And they said, well, for a man, medical necessity means medical necessity. If you need it, you get it. But for women, it means that for most things. But for abortion, it only means ectopic pregnancies, nothing else. Every other type of abortion-related issue that might be medically necessary, and although I am not a doctor, nor do I play one on TV, I am to understand that there are a great deal of medical conditions that might result in the need for an abortion. So the New Mexico court recognized what I just said and said, by defining a term, this is not about abortion, this is about a term. Defining a term differently for men and women does in fact violate the ERA. So it wasn't specifically about abortion, it was about how they governed themselves as far as terminology and trying to create a distinction. They made a mistake. There are other cases in other states where they didn't try to do it that way, where they just said abortion is not covered. Pennsylvania is probably the best litigated in that area. And the answer is men can't have abortions, and therefore there's no adverse effect or difference between the two. There is a biological reality. Women can have abortions, men cannot. And so we don't have to cover it. And that was upheld, similar to the Hyde Amendment at the federal level, that they simply will not provide coverage for it. Now, I'm a pro-life Republican. That is the difference between Susan and I, and that's okay. I think it's thrilling to have all of us in this room fighting for the same thing. I also know that abortion is protected, for those of you who favor that, in a number of different ways. Number one being, of course, the progeny of Roe versus Wade. But in recent months and years, states have taken the next step of creating what amounts to Roe versus Wade protections within their state constitutions. Illinois being one of those last session, where we passed the Reproductive Health Care Act, which ensured that even were Roe versus Wade to be overturned, you would still have those same protections in Illinois. So in my opinion, you don't need to tie the ERA to abortion, and it's a false tying. At best, what one can say is that if you are on public aid, Medicare, Medicaid, and you need an abortion for a medically necessary reason for the life or health of the mother, that you can get. And guess what? That's reflective of most socially conservative Republicans. They believe in an exception for the life and health of the mother. So we're not even very far apart on that very, very minor sliver. So this is something that can fit within that narrative. And what we really need to do is we need to blow the two apart. We need to say abortion is covered here, 14th Amendment, state level laws, and the ERA doesn't address that. The ERA does a different thing. It elevates women to the status that we have currently under the 14th Amendment for race. And so even that's not enough. This is a base limit. This is something that we start with. We're still going to need local laws. We're still going to need state level laws that protect pay equity. The Equal Rights Amendment will not solve every possible wrong, but it's our start. And even though we have achieved much without it over the last 50 years, no denying, those things can be rolled back. We've seen that. In the last 4 years, we've seen rollbacks when the right is not codified into the Constitution. And we can't let that happen. We can't allow the progress that we've made to go in reverse. That's what the ERA is all about, is solidifying the gains that we have and moving forward from there, because we are most assuredly not done. So with that, I have to ask our moderators, is the illustrious Senator Pat Spearman on the line? Because
we do not have Spearman on the line just yet.
okay. Well, then, if I can speak for just a minute more, I'm technically over my time, and I apologize for that. But one thing I'd like to tell you about is the organization that I have now created. So since I left the Illinois House and won Illinois, my intention was to not stop fighting for this. So I've traveled the country, East Coast, West Coast, North, South, and I have now, as of 2021, created a new organization called GOP4, the number 4, ERA.com. And I'd encourage you to take a look at it, whether you're a Republican or not. Because I think what I'm trying, well, I don't think I'm trying, I am trying to create that intersection, that place where Republican values that Susan talked about can mesh with the ERA. This is really an opportunity, if you will, to return my party, Susan's party, back to some of its core beliefs. We have strayed, quite frankly, in ways that I don't agree with. This is a chance to come back. And why not? If we're going to reboot the Republican Party and renew it, get that, everybody? My attempt at humor. If we're going to do that, what is a better place to start than the equal rights of women? 50+% of the population of the United States. How can that be a bad choice for Republicans? It's not. All we have to do is get past these artificial stumbling blocks that have been created by false narratives from Phyllis Schlafly and her progeny, so to speak. If we can do that, and that's my challenge, I've accepted it, and I'm looking for help. So if any Republicans out there, hint, hint, would like to join with me and try to work on that, we're going to support those Republicans who are willing to come back to the core beliefs. And that's my hope for what we can accomplish. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you. Oh, and I did forget one thing. I have a connection to Ohio that I wanted to tell you. My daughter is a Bearcat, so go Bearcats. Thank you.
Thank you so very, very much. Tammy, while we are waiting for Senator Spearman, I don't know if you wanted to cover any of the update information or if we need to try and
Just do that. Let's go to, yes. And I know that Helene has sent a text out, and I apologize that I can't do more outreach. I know that it was sent, and I do expect her to join us, but everything just from my phone. So thank you, Helene, because I don't want to.
I am watching, so as soon as she joins us,
Yeah.
I will interrupt what's happening to let you know that she's here. So if you want to go on.
Okay, so Sharon, why don't we get a quick update then from Georgia? Sharon J. Hill, we'll go to our reports real quick. We'll go to our reports and then we'll hopefully have Senator Spearman join us before we get to the Q&A. And then anyone else that has reports. So Sharon Hill.
All right. Good evening, everyone. And thank you so very much to our panel as we wait for the inimitable Senator Spearman. I am Sharon J. Hill here in Georgia, and thank you all so very much for your support. It is a time that as we are working together, that it is across the miles that the difference shall be made. I am glad to say that we do have our current legislation in the House and in the Senate, and But of course, you all know that we have been inundated with the other laws. The voter suppression is what is just overwhelming us. However, I am thankful for a new senator, uh, Nikki Merritt. She actually introduced here this session, and Representative Billy Mitchell, again, is hailing that banner in the House. But again, for us, it is about not just speaking it, but walking it. And so our challenge is getting all of the legislators signed on. We do we had bipartisan before, and it is now an uphill battle this time around, but we are still working. I was able to get a Republican senator on. Her question that I was able to answer for her was regarding the repealed and rescinded states. And as we are working, of course, we are one of the 12, of course, unratified. And so working from state to state, we need to roll from one to the other. And I'm thankful for the other states that are hailing this as well. So what we're doing is making sure that with our league here in Georgia, that is also the upcoming sessions that we are doing with our different chapters, of having that as a clear focus as it has come from the national, you all know that. And so keeping in that vein, we do have the interest with our other coalition of women organizations as well. We have Georgia Equality. While they are hailing the Equality Act, of course, I am driving it home that it can be undergirded by the Equal Rights Amendment deadline removal. It is imperative for all of the unratified states. So let us be mindful of what the ratifieds can help with what has been done, as Betty Foyert has been so awesome in sharing on how it's being worked, even for state constitution. We know that it will take all of it. And so from our local city council resolutions to our county resolutions and all of our organizations holding it up, we will have Black Women's Roundtable. The annual summit will begin on the 24th, and we have addressed it before. As a matter of fact, one of the founding members of Black Women's Roundtable, it was created to support the Equal Rights Amendment. And so as we're gaining support, it is so important that we work our messaging. And this is most awesome for us to be able to chronicle, to have it, and share as well. And we are working to have screenings, have in-service with our legislators as well. Our session ends on the 31st, so we will just have to keep it going and work on our US senators. That is where we are.
Thank you, Sharon. I understand from Helene that Senator Spearman will be joining us here. She said 7 minutes a couple minutes ago, so anytime. So is anyone else on the line that would like to do a quick report before Senator Spearman calls in? We have a few minutes.
Well, we have, okay, so if there's time, someone said, can Susan explain more about the problems with the primaries in some states? There's a conversation in the chat about.
Sure. That makes more fine.
Yeah.
I'm sure that Steve is probably better able to speak to this from a technical point of view. But my point is that, for example, in Connecticut, where I live, we don't have a presidential primary until August. By the time we had a primary, there were 2 candidates left running. There were 3 on the ballot, but one had just dropped out. And we started out with what, 17 candidates? So what good is my vote at that point. So that's what I'm saying. If some of these, if all of us could vote in a primary back when it's relevant earlier on in the process, maybe that would make a difference in who we could get. But they choose the national, I mean, Steve, you correct me where I'm wrong on this, but my understanding is that sort of the national organization chooses which states they want to have the primaries, and they pick it based on what they think they're going to get out of it. Now, I live in Connecticut, a very liberal state. The Republicans in Connecticut tend to be very liberal. We would not be the people who would necessarily be voting in a primary for Donald Trump. That's kind of my point. But Steve,
Me either. Me either. I would never vote for him and didn't twice. I didn't twice. Well, the states determine their own timing for their primaries, but you're right. I mean, there's a coordination going on there. So you're absolutely right when you say that there's a nationwide choice, and it's strategic, right? So that, you know, I mean, you know, Iowa, really? You know, Iowans, I mean, no disrespect to Iowans if there are any in the call, but Iowa, I mean, I like New Hampshire's response to that, which is Iowans pick corn, New Hampshireites, whatever they are, pick presidents. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of gamesmanship that goes on with all of it. You're certainly right. I saw your point in the chat about the idea that gerrymandering needs to be addressed. I personally think that there's only so much we can do with gerrymandering because of the nature of how people choose to live. We tend to self-select where we live. We live with like-minded people. So that becomes hard when you're trying to map into equal quadrants. One of my favorites, and this is very much off topic, but
Senator Spearman is joining us.
Well, then I'll stop other than to say ranked choice voting. Look it up.
Yes, thank you. And we now have, I believe she is joining us, Senator Spearman. Are you with us?
I am.
Yay.
Hello.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us, Senator Spearman, taking some time out of your committee. We've been talking about families, why the ERA is good for families, and you know, why it's a nonpartisan issue. And if you could just address that, please, we would be most appreciative to you.
Well, thank you. And I guess it's serendipitous that the bill that I was presenting, and that's the reason I couldn't get on, it was my bill. And I didn't think it would be a good idea to walk away from it. And I'm asking people to vote yes. So that I had really affords an opportunity for people who are in low wealth communities living in public housing or subsidized government housing, allows them an opportunity to have a separate escrow account. We call it the Individual Development Account, an IDA. And money can be put in there either by them or by someone else so that they can, one, they can buy a home, save to buy a home. Two, maybe they want to start a small business. It can be used for that. It can also be used for educational purposes. The other thing is it's also for children who age out of foster care. So I think when you pull those two together, anytime you're talking about equality, most of the time there's some type of a litmus test that people want to use to say this group deserves equality, but that group doesn't. And we voted on our state ERA this morning, and it passed out with 18 yes and 3 no's. And the people who were arguing that it was not necessary were also the people who I've heard in the past argue about programs to help people. Most of the families that are living either in or very near to poverty are led by women. When you start talking about retirement, more women retire in poverty than men. And that is because we do not have the ERA in our Constitution. And therefore, when someone finds out that they have been paid unequal compared to their male counterpart, in many places, there's no place to go. In Nevada, we just passed it in 2019, and it's illegal. You can't even ask somebody how much they make when they're, coming for a job interview. So when you start talking about the ERA, let's move away. If you move away from the legal arguments and just look at the common sense arguments. And I would say this: anytime you are lifting a woman and her family, even if she's not the sole breadwinner, anytime you are lifting them out of poverty and there is some type of legal anchor that they can hold on to, that they won't slip back into it, I think that that's a plus. And I think that given the financial abyss that most of our neighbors find themselves in today as a result of COVID, I don't know how many people saw the statistics on. In the pandemic, more women were laid off or fired, and more women were slower to get their jobs back. That is not an accident. That is a consequence of us not taking into account that everyone is created equal, and if you're doing the same job, you ought to be paid equally. And so once we have the ERA Constitution, then it's not just a matter of, well, you should have paid me, and I think that's against the law. No, because now you have a higher level of scrutiny. I have a constitutional right to be paid the same. And when we are not, and we don't know that, it's not just the salary that we miss, but we also miss the FICA, the retirement. We also miss the 401k and any other benefits. When we're not paid the same and our job descriptions are the same, when it comes time for promotions, we're not even looked at like the same. If we're not paid the same and we take vacation and you're going to take paid vacation, if I'm making $200 less than my male counterpart, we can take vacation at the same time and he will always come out with more money than I will. And so putting it into the Constitution just makes sense. And if for no other reason, those statistics that show clearly, more women have been lost in the economic abyss than you have men. If for no other reason than that, we have a moral obligation to those who are the least among us to put in place every anchor that we can to help them not to slip further and further and further back from an economic reality that would make them comfortable in their retirement. It's not a matter of getting rich, it's a matter of pay me the same. And I'll say this and then I'll be quiet. I say this all the time. Two things. People who are born in privilege don't understand what it means to fight for equality. And when I say that, fighting for equality, I'll qualify that by saying, I am already equal. What the ERA says is you need to recognize my equality and then act like you know. So when we start talking about this, there are sometimes people who they just don't get it. And so I think we have a right or responsibility to try to help them get it. But if they can't get it, then we shouldn't stop our progress because they can't get it. We're not going to stop until this is in the Constitution. This is not the 70s. This is not the 80s. This isn't the 90s. This is the 21st century. And guess what? Women are motivated. Men are motivated. Democrats are motivated. Republicans are motivated. Independents, independent leaning folks and people who don't even vote. They are motivated to make sure that we get this into the Constitution. And guess what? 20 years from now, our children and our grandchildren will be looking at this argument the same way many of us looked at slavery, the same way many of us looked at the fight for equal rights. We'll be saying, they'll be saying, what? You mean to tell me you actually had to argue for that? Well, that's a no-brainer. How come you had to argue for that? And the people who are against this, their names will be etched in history. So the last thing I'll say is, come and go with us as we make history, or stand on the sidelines and watch us make history. It's up to you. It's up to you.
Where's the applause button? Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Tammy, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm here. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Do you have a couple moments to stay on to, in case anybody has any questions, or do we let you go?
Yeah, I do. I have a couple of minutes. The committee meetings is not over, and I'm the vice chair, so I've got a couple of minutes.
Okay. Anybody have any questions?
I have a question, Tammy.
Okay.
I'd
Certainly.
like to direct this, if I could, to Senator Spearman and others, but particularly Senator Spearman. I know you've done a tremendous amount of work for transgender protection in your state. Back in 2013, you headed and pushed through a protection issue. And I know when I speak to people about the ERA as an openly queer pastor who has a lot of transgender members, they get very concerned because there tends to be a separation, particularly in our state, between people who are advocating for this as solely a quote unquote women's issue, even though, you know, the amendment has none of that language in it, versus people who are pressing this as an equality sex that is non-binary. I'm interested to know from a national perspective and also from a more local perspective, have you encountered people trying to split the ERA movement based upon transgender controversies around this, kind of like they've tried to use the abortion red herring? And what can you speak to around that? Senator, you're
When I was a pastor, I had several members of the transgender community who were in my church. Some people knew who the transgender persons were, and some people had no idea. And I usually start by saying this: how many transgender people do you know? How many do you know? How many have you interacted with? Because it's kind of like Harvey Milk said: if you know us, you know you have to fight with us. And so the first thing is, I say to people, you have probably encountered transgender people and have no idea that that's who they were. And the next thing that I say is, I will not allow anyone to split my full persona. I'm a Black woman, that's two, and I'm a member of the LGBTQ community, and you will not make me choose my Blackness over my queerness, or my queerness over my womanness. You will not do that. And so what we're talking about here is equality and lifting women up. And that's what the ERA talks about. But we also know that once you do that, you're lifting everybody else up. And so, you know, it's a moot point. It's a moot point. And finally, you know, if I'm talking to people, and I usually try to be really diplomatic, but you know, there's a certain kind of craziness that makes me become undiplomatic. You know, there's a certain amount of, you know, unintelligible verbiage that I can't abide by. And so then I will simply say, if you don't have a good reason to oppose this, and it has to be more than that which is warmed over from Phyllis Schlafly et al. Okay, when I brought the ERA to Nevada, this is no lie, there was a woman who came to the witness table and said, we cannot pass this because if we do, I was reading somewhere where there's more than like 4,000 different sexes. And you check the record, go back, because we have all that stuff on archive, okay? 4,000 different sexes. And if we pass this will allow women to marry the Eiffel Tower. And I said, and the camera was on my face, right? So I got a better poker face now, okay? I'm thinking, Jesus, you just did not say that in public. Where are your children? Because I'm sure they don't know you're out in public and in public talking like this. You're not going to make us separate based upon some outdated category. When I walk into a room, if you have people in there who are racist, I threaten them. If you have people in there who are misogynist, I threaten them. You have people in there who are homophobic, I threaten them. But you know what? I walk into that room like I own the power, and I don't let anybody try to make me think I don't belong. And if you are uncomfortable, one of us probably needs to leave. And I just took a seat.
I love that.
Again,
Thank you.
applause.
If I can jump in just a little bit to add to
Sure.
Pat.
Hey, my friend.
How are you? I told people, said I'm glad I got to go first because there is no topping Senator Pat Spearman. She is our rock star. But on this particular topic, I just want to add to what she said, which is when I was fighting it in Illinois, we got the questions that Reverend Terry, you mentioned, that this is going to open up all these, what they would characterize as horror stories, right? Mostly bathroom issues. Everything's a freaking bathroom issue. By the way, I've been in a non-gendered bathroom in a prestigious law firm in Chicago. It was gorgeous. There was no problems with that bathroom, by the way. They should all look like that. But to the
Excuse me,
point,
Steve, can I just interrupt you for just 1 minute?
of course,
Just 1 minute. My assistant just came in and told me to ask me to come back to the healthcare committee because they're voting on another bill. So it's been fun, you all, and I hope the next time is not on a day when I have committee meeting. But thank you so much, and I hope I've added something to the conversation. Okay, thank you so much. Keep up
So much for
the good
taking
work.
time.
thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you.
You.
So just to wrap that, we were told all these horror stories were going to happen. Well, what they didn't realize was that there are state level ERAs in about 22, I want to say, states, identical to the federal proposed, or in my opinion, now ratified 28th Amendment. And they've been there for 50 years. And guess what? None of those horrible things ever happen. So it's not going to happen when when it gets adopted into the federal Constitution. Those are nonsensical horror stories that they're trying to scare us with. The reality is none of that's going to happen other than in a controlled, logical way. Like, I actually support the idea of same-sex bathrooms. There are ways to design that. It's not a scary proposition. When you've been in one, and I have, it's really quite lovely.
Very
Well, it's a fancy bathroom with some big expensive law firm in Chicago. But
so thank you for that, Steve, and for piggybacking on that question from Reverend Terry, who's a staunch supporter of women's rights and ERA and all human rights, and we love Reverend Terry here and are so happy that he is part of our local league and on so many levels fighting for us. Should we? Okay, so it's about 8:07 now. We could still do some more questions, and we're just going to wrap it up. But when Sarah's ready to wrap it up, she's going to give some league announcements and also the actions that we can take. She's going to put them there in the chat, and we have everything up on our site, and you have your website up, Steve. So what should we do now?
Well, I have, I don't see any questions that we are missing in the chat. If anyone has a question, you're welcome to raise your hand or go ahead and unmute and ask it.
I just want to go back to Steve Anderson and thank you so much for addressing the abortion issue. I think probably Pat Spearman probably made it clear that you can't have conversations with people that are not listening, but I'm in conversation with two different representatives who say ERA equals abortion. That's it. And I don't know if there is just a really good, from a Republican male perspective, is there something I'm looking at all the pieces that we put into the conversation tonight, and I'm still trying to think of the best. Maybe there's not a comeback.
Yeah,
any help on that appreciated.
Yeah, there's not a zinger, right? It's not like you can just 3 words knock it apart. You have to explain it. And unfortunately, when you explain in politics, you're typically losing. What I have found, by the way, is that by being a pro-life Republican, when I go to Congress, when I go to state legislatures and I meet with the Republicans, their shields drop, because they realize they're talking to a guy who agrees with them and yet is still saying the ERA works within that worldview. And so I can get them to open their ears a little bit. That doesn't mean I've changed any votes yet, but you got to keep trying. So, but I do find that Republican to Republican can maybe make a little progress on something like that.
If I could jump in on this point, I think Susan wrote into the chat that she's pro-life. And I would describe myself as pro-life too, even though I also believe in the woman's right to choose an abortion. And I think there are ways to be pro-life that people on all sides of the political spectrum agree on, including pregnant worker fairness and reducing maternal mortality. Because if you do not accommodate pregnant workers on the job, you are not protecting unborn life. If you have the United States has the highest rate of maternal mortality amongst our peer wealthy democracies. If you have maternal mortality, that is also a threat to unborn life and born life. And so I think that there are ways of being pro-life that are compatible with gender equality. And I should also add that many of the countries that I've referenced that have had equal rights between women and men since World War I and World War II have had their own struggles with abortion rights. And one of the research projects I'm working on is looking at the ways in which they have developed abortion laws that permit abortion in some but not all circumstances and fund the ones that they think are worth having. That they started with very strong pro-life premises. The German Constitution has a human dignity provision that the Constitutional Court has read as protecting unborn life. And so I think there are different ways in which constitutional democracies struggle with this very deep question that leads to a lot of disagreement about which abortions are permitted and under what circumstances and which should be funded. And I don't think the ERA offers a clear and definitive answer. And I don't think that everyone who supports the ERA has to agree on what the correct abortion policy should be. But I think that many who support it from the standpoint of inequalities women face because they're mothers can agree to certain things, including being pro-life by addressing things and prioritizing as a policy maternal mortality and pregnant worker fairness. And the pregnant worker fairness law had huge bipartisan support in the House, but it wasn't passed in the Senate last year. And many, many states that are Republican-led have pregnant worker fairness laws. 30 states now have them. And I think these are the kinds of things that travel together with the ERA. And if anyone were to challenge the constitutionality of the pregnant worker fairness law on whatever grounds, the ERA could provide a shield in any such constitutional challenge. And I think that we should try to focus on those issues, those pro-life issues, rather than on the abortion question.
And thank you for that. And I respect your points and the way you self-describe on that. I'm using Republican verbiage because I speak Republican on that issue. And the conventional thing is pro-life, pro-choice. I've been told by the other group that I am anti-choice. That's the verbiage that has also been used. I'm trying to talk to people who want to listen in my party on this, because quite frankly, without Republican support, we don't get done. Yeah. I mean, we do not finish this without Republican support, which is why I'm trying to communicate in a language they understand. But I completely agree and support all of the things you just said, Professor, because it's so simple to say I'm pro-life and then I don't support early childhood interventions. I don't, I do, by the way, but it would be very easy to be very hypocritical on that subject. In fact, one of my favorites on this topic is we had a bill in Illinois that I supported that would make contraception free for everyone, period, the end. And I supported it as a pro-life, as I define it, person, because the best way to never have an abortion is to never get pregnant. And so allow people to have the choice never to get pregnant, never have to face that decision. So
Yes.
I want to say how much I support you.
There, that's a great point, Steve. And there's some questions over in the chat. And I think with what you were saying is, we're not going to do this without Republican support. And that's what your, new organization's all about. And we need Republican support. We've been trying here in Ohio to get the support of Senator Rob Portman since 2012. And while he has given us a pretty broad statement that he opposes discrimination of any kind, and he has said that he will monitor this legislation as necessary, and we think it's necessary for him to monitor it and support it. And that's what are we doing? What should we be doing? And you said you would help us.
Yes,
and I think you're going to be able to do that. So could we talk about that and about what happened today in the briefing just quickly?
Sure. So we had a Senate staff briefing this afternoon. I've lost a little track. Went very well. We had Republican Senate staffers on the line. They asked some good questions. They talked about abortion, so we were able to deal with that. And that's good. I mean, that's kind of like the background step, is to try to educate them on the realities of the situation. But in truth, I say this a lot, is data and facts don't sway votes. They don't. What sways votes are relationships and constituents. And so where you have relationships, exploit them, not in like an unethical way, but exploit the relationships and the positivity that you can engender out of that. But the other thing is, I talk about positive pressure, not negative pressure. It is, if you go as a group to Senator Portman and you say, we are going to vote you out of office if you don't pass this. In his mind, I can tell you what he's thinking. Number one, he's thinking you're all a bunch of Democrats, so you're not voting for me anyway. So I don't need to listen to you.
Yeah, and he's retired anyway, so we couldn't threaten him with that anyway. So.
Okay, but well, pick another. But the point is the same. On the other hand, positive pressure can change the world, in my opinion, because if you instead fill that room with self-identified Republican women who favor the ERA, and that's what we have to build up. And by the way, not just women, men and women. And they come in and they say, we want you to vote for this. And when you do, we got your back. We're going to knock doors for you. We're going to raise money for you. When you get blowback from your extreme base, we're going to be there to be your supportive base. And that gives them ammunition to maybe consider changing their mind.
Thank you for that. And we will also be reaching out to Senator Brown more. Senator Brown has supported this legislation since 2012, but as you know, with the approach of the quote unquote Noah's Ark, with bringing the senators on 2 by 2, we need Senator Brown to be reaching out to Senator Portman all the more, and obviously with the other senators across the country doing that. So we have a lot of work to do for sure, but we're very excited to have you really behind this effort. You all just even showed up on our Saturday morning committee calls, so we know you're serious, and that makes us very happy. And to the other people on the committee and our speakers as well. Anything else, Sarah, or anyone else? That we're at around 8:18. We still have some time before you need to wrap it.
Well, I don't know if you have a few moments for me to say anything.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Helene.
Right. Hello. I'll put my mug back on if I can. I don't.
You're muted.
What, did we lose her?
No, she's
No,
muted.
I see what I did.
There she is.
blew it. All right. So I'm in Bolinas, California, which is the birthplace of our organization, Katrina's Dream. It's a small coastal Northern California community. And I listened very carefully to everything everyone said. So Steve, I'm hoping you will participate with us on a couple of calls I'll have planned. I'll email you directly in that we need to reach out to Susan Collins. I have a small team put together there. I'm going to follow up with another person who wrote an editorial piece in Iowa from the Zonta organization. And I think you'll be instrumental in participating and reaching out and then doing your own personal follow-up through your own organization afterward, if you don't mind me calling upon you for that.
Absolutely not. I need that.
Oh,
I need
all
your,
right,
I need your help identifying.
yeah. So having said that, I'll move on to, and I'm hoping that it will be put up in the words of the league here, but on our organization's page, katrinasdream.org, there's a section called Power of 10. It has been updated to read SJ Res 1. It was first put up when it was SJ Res 6. The Power of 10 is loosely based upon network marketing principles like Amway and Avon, and that if we can identify, working with Steve in the weeks to come, those 11 golden Republican senators, and then through the Power of 10 program, where I reach out to 10 people and I encourage them to reach out 10 people. We then have a flood of calls in through those various chapters, like through the League of Women Voters in Maine. There must be a few chapters that you folks can help me get put in touch with, and the people that I'm working there with. And that those numbers will grow each week as a one-on-one 10 times 10 times 10. So I always try to bring people back to how those personal connections work. And there's a small script on that page as well. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you, Steve, for being here. And I'm going to be scouring this for some quotes for my upcoming press advisory. So thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much, Helene. I appreciate that, because you're kind of segueing into, I guess, the action piece on our website, and I will see if I can share this so people can at least have an idea of where to find this. On our website at lwvchillicothe.org/ERA, we have an entire page dedicated to our ERA committee activities. It lets you know if you want to be part of the LWV Chillicothe ERA Action Committee. This is how and when you get a part of that. At the bottom, we have the information that Helene was talking about, contacting Senator Rob Portman. This is the information, how to get in touch with him about bipartisan Senate SJ Res 1. It also gives you information if you want to stay involved with what we're doing. You can join a call that is had Wednesdays at noon. So all of that information is available on our website at lwvchillicothe.org/ERA. And I just forgot what I was saying. So that's kind of our action. Is we want people to contact their reps. We want, and of course for us, for Ohio, that means Senators Portman and Senators Brown. So that is our call to action. We want people to not only do that call yourself, but we want you to get 10 people, 10 friends, and get them to do that as well. And you can refer them to our page with that information to have, so that they have the numbers to call our senators. And that's the piece I have for the action. It's pretty simple. We want to call. We want to make sure that they understand that this is supported and that this is something that needs to happen. That is our program for the evening. If you are a member of the league, please stay on for a few moments longer. I have just a handful of announcements for our league members. I would like to thank all of our panelists so much for taking time, for joining us here in Chillicothe over Zoom to give us all this wonderful information. It's very helpful as we have conversations and try to get this moving forward. This recording, fingers crossed, will be available soon, either on YouTube or on our website, maybe both. I just have to get the details sorted out and get it up there. So thank you so much, everyone, and we appreciate you coming. Just give me a moment. I'm going to stop recording.